So Danny Haiphong is an independent journalist and geopolitical analyst. He is the host of a YouTube Rumble show under his own name, Danny Haiphong, covering developments in the struggle between the U.S.-led unipolar world and the emerging multipolar world. He is the co-author of American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, A People's History of Fake News. That sounds like a good read. Welcome, Danny.
Thanks for having me today. Good to be with you, Russell and Keaton.
Thank you. And we have my long-suffering co-host, Keaton Weiss. Houthis vow to respond after U.S.-UK launch airstrikes in Yemen. Oh, goody. The U.S. and U.K. launched about 70 airstrikes on Houthi targets in Yemen in an effort to stop shipping attacks in the Red Sea, though the Iran-backed group pledged to retaliate with an urgent response. Addressing tens of thousands of supporters Friday at a rally in the Yemeni capital of Sana'a, Mohammed Ali al-Houthi, a senior leader, said a countermove would be imminent. The Houthis' campaign against commercial vessels will be expanded, and all U.S. and U.K. interests are now legitimate targets alongside those linked to Israel, the group said earlier. The military action underscores the deepening fallout across the Middle East from the Israel-Hamas war, which shows no sign of ending after entering a fourth month. Well, eventually they're going to run out of buildings to flatten. The Houthis started attacking ships in mid-November, ostensibly in support of Hamas, which is also backed by Iran, and have said they won't back down until Israel stops fighting in Gaza. The strike started about 2:30 a.m. Yemen time, with residents in Sana'a and Red Sea port city of Hodeidah reporting huge explosions. Other Houthi-held towns were hit, including Sada, Taiz, and Haja, the group said. The Houthis said there were 73 strikes in total and that 5 fighters were killed. It's unclear if there were any civilian casualties. The U.S. military said 16 sites were hit, including airports, radar installations, and storage and launch sites for drones and missiles. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said initial indications were that the strikes were successful in degrading the Houthis' ability to attack shipping. Our aim is very clear. It's to de-escalate tensions and to restore stability to the region, Sunak told broadcasters Friday, adding that the Houthis are, quote, disrupting the global economy. So this is a graphic from Bloomberg here. You could see they've got it coded to government and allies backed by Saudi Arabia. That's kind of the orange. The yellow territory where you see the bomb marks, that's Houthi controlled. You have in the south there, the Southern Transitional Council. Maybe Danny can explain that to us when we get to it. And the blue section is Al-Qaeda and allies. So we have a little footage. Okay. So Danny, can you give us some insight on that and in the overall situation in Yemen?
Yeah, well, the situation is certainly a grave one. It's one of escalation. And you read off Rishi Sunak's statement. Joe Biden had a very similar one, claiming that this is some kind of way of de-escalating what is happening in the Red Sea. But it's important to note that Yemen's solidarity blockade, which is what it is, in solidarity with Gaza, of ships that go through the Red Sea. It's important to note that the Red Sea is incredibly important for global trade, with a huge percentage, upwards of 40% of all Europe, Asia trade going through the Red Sea. Their solidarity with blockade targeted ships related to Israeli activity, to Zionist activity. And no one has died from this blockade, and it's been months now in the making. So the United States, they formed this Operation Prosperity Guardian, the results of which have been relatively fruitless. Many of the so-called allies that were supposed to join France and many other Western countries decided, actually Italy, to tap out in many respects. But the U.S. launched strikes anyway. It was Lloyd Austin launching strikes from his hospital bed of a medical condition that I'm sure you guys covered this, a medical condition he refused to tell the Biden administration about, all the way up until he started to have complications. So the strikes, they launched at around 60 sites, supposedly, according to Yemen's military. 5 people have been killed. I saw local media reports from Yemen saying about 20 people perhaps have been killed. The numbers, I think, are still relatively unknown. But this is a major escalation. This really is part and parcel of what the U.S. has claimed to be afraid about when it comes to Israel's onslaught in Gaza, which is being dragged into a regional war. But everything that the United States has done, from Operation Prosperity Guardian all the way back to October 7th, October 8th, when the United States was sending aircraft carriers and other escalatory military installations to the region, all of it has been pointing to a broader war that Israel really wants with Hezbollah, a broader war that Israel really wants with the entirety of the resistance. And the resistance, the axis of resistance, Yemen being one of the biggest players in this, Ansar Allah, they have not backed down. And everything that you said here in this report, where the Houthis, Ansar Allah, not backing down, is entirely true. Even the Pentagon is admitting this. So the point here is that this is a major escalation, and it is one that has absolutely no outcome that can benefit the United States. I think this is really the astounding part here, is that the Biden administration has really put itself in a hole that it won't be able to climb out of unless it really de-escalates and simply attempts to ignore that this thing happened. But Ansar Allah will not ignore it, and we can expect some kind of retaliation in the next 24 to 48 hours.
All right. So
at that point, I mean,
go ahead.
It only grows from there, does it not? I mean, this just seems like, as you referenced, just suicidal, like insanity, because it's hard to see at what point, at what volley do things calm down. That just seems to be impossible at that point. And as you said, we seem to be egging this on, right? I mean, not only are we provoking World War III, we are instigating it on purpose, it seems.
Yes. And the interesting thing here when it comes to Ansar Allah, when it comes to Yemen, is that this is already a country that has been at war from a U.S.-backed Saudi coalition for nearly a decade now. And that war has just started to de-escalate over the last couple of years, really in the last 6 months to a year, with some of that credit going to the diplomacy that was brokered by China between Saudi Arabia and Iran last year. So this country and Ansar Allah, which is the United States and much of the Western world, and they've been successful in delegitimizing the current Yemeni government, but it is the legitimate government of the Yemeni people. That's why when we're talking about Ansar Allah, we're not just talking about some kind of fringe movement. We're talking really about the equivalent of the defense ministry of Yemen. They are the legitimate state of Yemen. And so when the United States and the UK decided to launch these attacks on their own, Saudi Arabia refused to go along with it. Oman refused to go along with it.
Rokana actually tweeted out, if you had told me a few years ago that we'd be in a situation where the U.S. is bombing Yemen with Saudi Arabia urging caution, I would have told you were crazy.
Exactly. This has been the theme ever since the U.S. decided to form its so-called Operation Prosperity Guardian. Saudi Arabia was very clear that it was not going to relaunch an escalated campaign inside of Yemen at this time because of all of the developments that are happening in the region. And this is also important to note that in the region, there have been huge shifts away from U.S. influence. The biggest ones being UAE, Saudi Arabia joining BRICS, and these countries being increasingly unhappy with and also antagonistic to U.S. policy designs in the region.
On that point. On that, let me ask you something, because I'm not sure if this is true. I saw something that said Oman was the only country that was refusing to allow the U.S. to use their airspace for these actions. Is that true? Do you know anything about that?
Right. No, it's unclear. There were reports. I don't think there's been any confirmation from, let's say, the Saudi government, for example, that their airspace was allowed to be used. But I do believe you are exactly correct that the only confirmation we've received of countries in the region that refused it has been Oman.
Now, why is that? If they're moving away from American interests, why aren't more of them saying not over our airspace?
It's a delicate situation. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been playing a game of, in my estimation, of a balancing act. They understand that to be completely in the pocket of the United States is a suicidal path at this time. However, they also understand that they are actually in the pocket of the United States in many different respects, especially militarily, especially when it comes to security. So a lot of Saudi Arabia's and UAE's, and especially the Arab League, mainly as a whole, with a few exceptions, such as Syria now re-entered, these countries in the main, we saw Bahrain, for example, being maybe the biggest actually participating in this exercise and these airstrikes. These countries still do have pretty deep connections with the United States and also to Israel. I think that's why we've seen these countries talk a lot. Even Turkey, right? We have Erdogan saying that the U.S. is seeking and the U.K. are seeking to turn the Red Sea red. Well, Turkey at the same time has done very little in terms of any kind of political or economic intervention into the conflict in Gaza that would express any kind of solidarity. Yemen really has stood out in a huge way in terms of its concerted action, its concerted solidarity, one that has not caused any casualties. So this is why the whole defensive posture from the US and the UK is absolutely just ludicrous. But it has had a real impact. These strikes are emblematic of that huge impact that this blockade has had. What Yemen is doing is really standing up to the plate in a real courageous way, under conditions of complete and utter hostility and war. I mean, Yemen is probably the most oppressed nation on earth, unless we talk about Palestine, which of course has been completely restricted and held back from being able to exercise its self-determination as a nation.
Yeah, as we, on the other side of this, when we get more into the response, we're going to get into the horrific genocidal actions that were taken by Saudi Arabia in conjunction with the U.S. against Yemen. Because it's remarkable to me after that they have the resources to even do this. Now, a few months ago, Iran, it seemed like they were trying to get the other nations in the region to get together to take an action like this, and they wouldn't do it. Do you recall what I'm talking about? This is right when this started. Iran convened a conference, and nobody wanted to get involved, or nobody was willing to get on board with it.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, the axis of resistance is powerful in the region, but at the same time, the region itself, there's a reason why the Palestine question, Palestinian people have in the main been unsuccessful in being able to hold back Israel's ongoing genocide and really its ongoing occupation that is years and years, decades and decades in the making. And in many respects, it's because the United States, its Western allies, or we call them vassals at this point, they have been successful in placating and propping up a political situation in the region, which is heavily divided. And so those divides, while there has been, I think, immense progress in moving away from U.S. influence, there still is a lot of paralysis, we could call it. And I believe that what Yemen is doing, what Ansar Allah is doing, is they are making it so it's impossible to be paralyzed. And it's impossible for some of these other Arab countries or Muslim majority countries to just stand back. and do nothing in the face of this horrible atrocity.
Come see us do a live stand-up show. We'll be in Venice, California, Palmdale, California, Omaha, Des Moines, Milwaukee, Lansing, Bend, Oregon, Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington, Boston, Massachusetts, and we're going to Europe. Do you live in Europe? We're going to be there. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for all those tickets.